allow chewing.
Or,
Okay, so 2 days.
All right.
tell my kids that.
All righty then. Today, I know it's listed as kind of called a generic term, contracts class, but we're going to be focusing on contingencies and contingency removals, which are a critical piece of a contract. Does everybody know who I am? I'm Bruce Hammer. I'm the broker of record, managing broker here. Good to meet y'all. Thank you for coming. So first of all, when you talk about contingencies, does anybody have a feeling as to why they are important to a contract? If you're representing a buyer, why are contingencies important to you?
Like their protection
Good. A little more? Protection from what?
from losing their deposit.
Yes, that's part of it. Good. Anything else?
Using your full property.
Well, yes and no. So let me just back up a little bit. When you say contingency, when you use the word contingency in the context of a contract, what it means is, in order for that ratified contract to have leverage over either the buyer or the seller, if there are contingencies involved, those contingencies need to be cleared. Now, sometimes you'll talk about contingencies that give the buyer a certain period of time to inspect the property and to review the seller's disclosure. And the buyer, depending on how the contract is completed, will have 17 days, which is the default, or if their agent is trying to make buyer's offer more attractive, they might shorten that inspection period. Now, here's a critical piece about contingencies in the context of our contract that we currently use. A contingency will remain in place until it is expressly, meaning in writing, removed by the buyer, or if it's a seller contingency, the seller. So a little history in the context of our standard residential purchase agreement. When I moved out from the Bay Area to Sacramento in 2002, we had a much different purchase contract we have today. In 2002, the contract that was being used and that what you would get from WIN forms, which is what zip forms was known as back then, had passive contingencies in them. What that meant was you present an offer for your buyer to purchase a house today, and the seller accepts it today. So tomorrow becomes day one. Well, in a passive contingency situation, when you hit 17 days, if that's what your inspection period was, you don't have to do anything. Buyer didn't have to do anything. On day 17, that contingency automatically was cleared. And on day 21 or day 26, whatever the day was for loan contingencies in that contract, if the agent took the default on the form, the loan contingency was removed and the appraisal contingency and all that stuff. Well, what happened is real estate agents that weren't on top of their game and really managing their escrows, their deals for their clients, started getting their clients into trouble, and client may decide they wanted to cancel, but because those contingencies were already removed, they would end up losing their deposit. So the folks behind zip forms or WIN forms back then, they modified the form. And what they did is they made all of the contingencies in such a way that the contingency would remain in place unless they were expressly canceled by the buyer, by the seller for seller contingency. And that's kind of what we're working with today. And so when you write your offer, I don't know your level of production, but how many of you have actually written off using? You have? You have not? Yeah, okay. So if you look at this first page here, this is actually what you will see if you go into zip forms and you start to prepare an offer. Now, before this page, you're going to have, agency disclosure, which is the first thing that you're going to have to go over with your client. You're going to have some warnings about fair housing violations and antitrust, electronic wire transfers, and, all that sort of thing. Okay? But
What time did it start? I'm sorry.
we started about 8 minutes ago.
Okay, cool.
Come on in. There's a hand up for you.
Thank you.
So you have all these kind of precursor forms that are packaged into the residential purchase agreement. But what they did is you get to this is actually the second page of the actual contract. Right above this is where you're going to have your client's name and property address, the parcel number, and all that good stuff. Then you get down into and you will also have the purchase price and the loan terms. Part of the loan terms anyway. We'll see some more here. But when you get to the second page, this is the page that actually contains, amongst other things, a section on contingencies. And you can see here, beginning at section L, that's the section where we start with contingencies. And you can see there's like, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 major contingencies that are involved in a contract. And by default, all of these are defaulted to 17 days. There's no default date for the sale of buyer's property because that would fall in a different form, and that's a seller contingency. All of these are buyer contingencies. And, sometimes, depending on the market, I just threw this in here. It's always going to be 17 days unless you want to change it to something else, which you can do manually. There's a grayed out box on the original that you can fill in a different date or a different number of days here. But depending on the market that you're in, you may want to change the default date. So like I was writing up an offer for an agent this morning. I was helping an agent out this morning, and it's a pretty, I think if you know anything about what's going on today, you'd say that it's a competitive market now. So in his case, he wants to do a 12-day inspection. And so on almost all these, he's dropped the 17 days down to 12, because that way when the listing agent is presenting the offer to the buyer, buyer may want to, get these contingencies removed quicker so they know that they have a buyer that's really, got their skin in the game and is ready to, work and close the deal. So anyway, you can go with the standard 17. You can change it to something else. Just depends on the circumstances and the market. But let's break down a couple of these in little sections. So what I did here for you is the first few contingencies direct you to sections 8A, 8B, 8C, and 8D in the actual body of the contract. You can see here, I pulled this from page 5 of 16. Purchase contract is pretty long these days. But what they did is they took that one section and they took all the critical pieces, put it on 1 or 2 pages. So, and that's important because a lot of times with the last version of the contract, it was really tough. If you weren't really super familiar with that contract, it was really tough to be able to go through and find the section of the contract that say pertain to, a property inspection or inspection of the property, or where the title contingency was, or anything like that. So they made it really easy. They have that nice little grid there that shows you not only the section of the contract that it pertains to, but where that's located. And so we can refer to it like that. So here, we're going to look at the first contingency, which is loan contingency. Now, in order to remove a loan contingency, generally, if you're representing a buyer, you're going to want to make sure that if an appraisal is required, the appraisal is in, and that after the appraisal gets done, usually a lender will take that appraisal and any notes of the appraiser, like let's just say there are condition issues that have to be fixed or will appraise at that value, or she said, they'll send it to their underwriting department. And the underwriting department has to do their thing, and then most lenders, they'll sit down and they'll say, okay, we're clear to close, now we got to draw documents. And so they draw documents, and then there's a statute, they have to issue what's called a CD. Once the CD is issued, along with those docs, then there's a statutory period, I want to say it's 3 days. I think it's 3 days where the buyer is allowed to sign the loan docs. Kind of like give them time to really think about it. Once the loan docs are signed, then the title company can, finish requesting the wire. And, once the wire comes, they'll record the deed. Everybody's happy because the deal's closed. But the thing that comes before that, of course, is getting the appraisal done and getting the loan contingency taken care of. So here you can see under L1, 8A, and if you go down to my notes here, 8A says, this agreement is, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 3L1 or an attached CR form, that's a contingency rule form, contingent upon buyer obtaining the loan specified. So, and then if it's contingent, buyer shall act diligently in good faith to obtain the designated loans. That's the key section here. And what this means is, if the lender, after looking at the buyer's, in this case for his loan, it looks at his verification of income, his credit report. Normally, ideally, they're going to do all that stuff up front. But then, sometimes things happen down the road, and I'll give you a couple examples in a moment. But let's just say the buyer is really working hard to get this loan. The buyer is doing everything the lender asks. Lender says, I need pay stubs going back X number of years. I need tax returns going back X number of years. Buyer immediately gets that stuff over to the lender. And the lender puts it all into their formula, and the lender says, gee, sorry, looks like you can't qualify. Well, that is an out for the buyer. Buyer can then cancel. Buyer is entitled to their earnest money deposit to be released from title. That is a legitimate reason. What is not a legitimate reason, and I'm going to refer back to buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans. It is not good faith when the lender tells the buyer, I need a copy of last year's tax return file. And the buyer thinking, well, I really don't want this house, but I've already passed my inspection period and moved that contingency, so I can't use that anymore. I'm just going to, drag my feet getting that tax return to the lender. And the lender finally says, you know what, we can't move forward. We can't give you this loan because you haven't given us the tax return. Well, that is not working in good faith. And if a buyer tries to cancel and the lender later says, because any good listing agent would want a letter from the lender saying, why isn't this person able to, get the loan if the buyer's trying to get their earnest money back. I won't say any good agent, but if you've had a buyer that's kind of dragged the transaction out for a while, and your listing agent, your seller is really ticked because they lost all this marketing time, in order to satisfy the client, the listing agent might say to the lender, or say to the buyer's agent, I need you to get me a copy of the lender's letter saying they're not. And then if the lender's letter says, well, they're not qualified because the buyer never got us his tax return. Well, that could be considered bad faith. So in a case like that, the seller might fight to keep the buyer's deposit under that clause. Let's see. And if you go into the appraisal contingency, the agreement, unless otherwise specified on the attached contingency removal form. So anytime it says that, it just means that the buyer has already removed the contingency for the appraisal. Sometimes in a competitive market, you'll have an offer that's actually submitted to the listing agent where the buyer's already said, I don't have an appraisal contingency. I'm paying cash, so I don't have a loan contingency, and it's all done up front. And so they don't have these to fall back on. And that's what that's referring to there. So this agreement, unless otherwise specified in 3L2 or an attached contingency removal, is contingent upon a written appraisal of property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than the amount specified in paragraph 3L2. Now, pretty self-explanatory. The house has to appraise for the amount in the contract. Now, a buyer is able, in many circumstances, to write it into their offer and say, I'm not going to have an appraisal contingency. And by the way, I will get an appraisal, but if it doesn't appraise, I'm willing to bridge the amount. In other words, let's just say your house is selling for $100,000, but it only and you're getting a loan for say you're doing 100% financing, and you're getting a loan for $100,000. If it doesn't, normally if you're getting a loan and it didn't appraise for $100,000, you couldn't get the loan because the lender would not have the security for that loan in the event you closed because you stopped payments. So when I talk about a buyer waiving the appraisal contingency or saying if it doesn't appraise, I'll make up the difference. Let's just say it only appraises for $90,000. The buyer within the contract can agree to come in with an additional $10,000 down payment to bridge the gap between the appraisal and the actual value. And that is permissible. The only time that you definitely cannot write that into a contract where a buyer agrees to take the property even though it doesn't appraise is in the case of an FHA financed buyer or a VA. You can write it into the contract, but it's not legally enforceable against the buyer. It's an FHA. Okay, it's considered what they say under the laws. It's considered to be against public policy. Okay, so that's appraisals. We talk about no appraisal contingency. If no appraisal contingency is checked in paragraph 3L2, then buyer may not use the loan contingency specified to cancel the agreement. That's obvious. Let's see, investigation of property. This actually encompasses a whole lot. Talks about this agreement is contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition and of any other matter affecting the property, and it refers to paragraph. Let's see if I have that here. Paragraph. So I'll go all the way down. Oh, I didn't reference paragraph 12. But essentially, what we're talking about here is investigation of property actually overlaps with a lot of the other contingencies because it talks about not just a physical inspection of the property, it talks about circumstances of the street, of the surrounding community. Are there fences that falling apart that back up to an alley? Is there natural hazards in the area that you're able to discover? It could encompass a whole myriad of different things that a buyer can, in good faith, legitimately use to cancel a contract if it's done before they remove this contingency. Most of your cancellations, you'll refer on the cancellation form to some circumstance involving the investigation of the property. It could mean review of the seller documents, which you see as the next one. It could involve review of the natural hazard disclosure. Are you all familiar with natural hazard disclosure? Okay. So, and in California, the civil code requires that the seller provide either the natural hazard disclosure reporting form or provide it through a third-party provider like property ID, disclosure source, other. The advantage, if you're on the listing side, the advantage to your client in using one of the third-party reporting companies is that they get a safe harbor if some piece of that information is incorrect. So if property ID or disclosure source makes a mistake, if they make a mistake and somebody is sued because of it, they will step in and deal with the suit. So there's a big advantage to encourage your clients to spend the $100 or whatever it costs if you are representing the seller. And I should tell you, if you have any questions while I'm speaking, please stop. You know.
So if the seller decides for that HDA.
Say that again.
So if the seller decides the.
Well, the buyer, when you write the offer, you can put it into the contract which specific company you would like the seller to use. And then generally what the seller, once escrow, you know, the seller, the listing agent will tell the escrow officer, would you please order this from, you know, it's in the contract, order property ID or disclosure source company. One thing to note too, we here at KW, we also have an in-house natural hazard disclosure reporting company. However, if you use the in-house reporting company, there is an affiliated business that you also have to have compliance on. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
Is it caps?
Yeah, yeah.
But they're not really, right?
I don't think so.
So,
Yeah, I don't think so.
okay.
Okay, so appraisal, we got investigation, review of seller documents. Okay, so I'm going to talk to two aspects of this review of seller documents. One, I'm going to talk to you if you're working on the listing side. I'm going to talk to you if you're working on the buyer side. If you take a listing, I highly encourage you all, have the disclosures that you need to have the seller with you when you do the rest of the listing paperwork. If nothing else, you have to, by all means, leave those disclosures for the seller to complete. But pick them up and have them in your physical possession, if at all possible, before you go active in the MLS with this. The reason you want to do that is because once you accept an offer on the selling side, on the listing side, once you've accepted an offer and have that ratified contract, the time clock starts running. And you, as the representative of the seller, you don't want to put your seller in breach because for whatever reason, they're procrastinating. You can't get those documents filled out in a reasonable period of time so you can get them over to the buyer side. Because you'll find that, let's just say you had a 10-day, the buyer had a 10-day period to review these documents. If the seller doesn't, you know, they drag their feet, whatever, they can't figure out how to email, scan them an email, you can't connect with them, they don't get those documents back to you until, say, day 8. Well, what happens is the buyer has to have, under the law, a minimum of 5 days from the time they receive those documents to review them. And if they so choose, to cancel their purchase based on the receipt of those documents. So if you wait until day 8, they actually have a total of 13 days now on their contingency to review those documents and make a decision to cancel. So if your seller drags their feet, they're harming themselves. And if you let them drag their feet, then you're helping them themselves. So best way to resolve that is just make sure if you can't get the stuff done when you take the listing, then make arrangements to have it in your possession before you go live with MLS. That solves all. So all of the seller's disclosures are going to go over to the buyer. The natural hazard disclosure report, that'll go over to the buyer. Title companies can kick those out in a matter of a few minutes. They're generally processed. The other items that will fall into play here are preliminary title reports. Usually within a few days of opening escrow, depending on the title company, sometimes the very first day, you will get a prelim. They print out a preliminary title report. That shows you the condition of title. One of those other little tidbits that might be helpful to you, oftentimes we use the realist tax records. We, prepare our listing paperwork. It's generally fairly accurate, but oftentimes the names are off. Sometimes you'll see a problem with the seller's name, owner's name, because they didn't pick up the correct name of the trust the property was deeded, if it was deeded. Sometimes they'll get the first and last name backwards if it's a foreign sounding name. Like in downtown, they just get it wrong. Sometimes they actually have typos in the name. I've had that many that happen. So if you have a friendly name down at a local title company, it never hurts. Ask them to pull a property profile on ahead of time so that you can get the correct vesting title so that you can kind of flat out on the listing paper, either at the home doing it or if all else fails, when you get your preliminary title report, you want to read through it. You don't want to just be a paper shop and send it off to your buyer client to review and sign that they've read it. You want to actually take a moment to look at it. They look, sometimes they can look overwhelming, but there's only a few points of information with them that are really super. And last thing you want to do is give it to your client, tell them, oh yeah, it's good, and then you waive your contingencies down the road for the condition of title, and you realize after the fact, when it's too late to back out without sacrificing deposit, that there was something glaring in that prelim that you should have jumped out at. For example, and this wouldn't prevent the deal from going through, but let's just say the seller actually put their property into a trust. Normally it's going to be a revocable trust, which, that's pretty common. And just know for yourselves, if you own property, it's always a good idea to look at your property trust, because in California, if something were to happen to you, it bypasses probate. And if you have to go into probate, it can take a year. Beneficiaries will get a hand on the property, and it's very expensive. So that's I said my little spiel about trust. But you'll get the exact name for your listing agreement, which then you can have in your listing agreement to make sure you have a binding contract with the seller if you're on the listing side. If you're on the buyer side, you want to make sure that there's no liens or encumbrances that are other than the loan that is paid off. The buyer has, if he has a loan, if he owns it outright, it's not going to show a loan. But it will also show other easements that might be on. An easement is something like like utility companies will have easements. And I'll give you an example. If you drive through Thomas Park, Regency Park, or any of these communities around here, sometimes you'll see these huge green metal boxes sitting right in the middle of the grass in the house. Or you'll see cable television things sitting out in the lawn. Those are easements that were granted by the original developer to SMUD, to XYZ cable company, so they can have their utilities, that they need for the community there. May not have to have anything to do with just that house. It might be a lot, but they have an easement that's granted to them on title to have their equipment there, and they're allowed to come onto the property to maintain it, all sorts of stuff like that. If you get into North Highlands, some of those areas, go into a backyard and you see a telephone pole or electrical pole in the backyard, and these wires going across the yard, going into the next, the neighbor's. Again, that's an easement, and they are allowed to enter that backyard to do their work. Well, you may now know this, but it would probably be a good idea to explain what this is to the buyer, so that 2 years down the road, when SMUD is found in their backyard working, and buyer comes out and says, "What the heck are you doing in my backyard?" And they say, "Well, we have a right to be here." Buyer gets ticked off and is mad at you and posting all over the Yelp. My agent screwed me, didn't tell me this was going to happen. All this other stuff. So anyway, go through the prelim and just make sure there's no issues there. The other thing you want to look for, big red flags, things like IRS tax. Sometimes, the IRS will levy a tax lien and they will attach it to the home. Well, if you're buying a house and it's a $300,000 or $400,000 home, and the guy's got $1 million IRS tax lien now attached to that home, he's not going to be able to complete the sale. He's not going to be able to complete that sale because the IRS is going to block it. So
That's the same as the.
no, there are recurring liens, and if I think what you're referring to is probably like mellow loose taxes, things like that for every year. Is that what you're referring to?
I remember when the lender wouldn't give the money because there was like a lien that they had to still pay.
Well, there's a ton of different liens that franchise tax, IRS, counties, you name it. These governmental bodies, they will attach the property so the property can't be sold unless that lien is paid. So I'm not sure about the term recurring lien, but rest assured, even your normal property taxes are lien. But what it's going to say in the prelim is going to say, it's going to reference the annual taxes for last tax year. It's going to say if it's paid current or not. And then your escrow officer is going to use that information. They'll contact the taxing authority at the last minute, find out if there's any changes, what the daily tax rate is, and they will adjust the prorations on the settlement right before it closes, so that anything that is not yet paid but was prorated to that date, so that the buyer's not paying property taxes for a period where they own the property, the seller's not. But you get all this information on the prelim. Now, the thing about prelims is usually into the transaction, when you start getting a little farther along down the road, the title company will do an update. And I don't know the reason for it on the original prelims, but I can tell you almost 100% of the time when I have gotten a prelim on an escrow I've opened, usually the date on the prelim is usually like a week or 2 weeks before the date we actually. And so all I can think of is that when they pull that data from the county, they use what's called the Reporting Act. Every state has it. When they pull that data from the county, they pull it as of their last update, which was on such and such date. And then at some point during your transaction, they're going to do an update. And let's just say everything looked great initially, and then you've removed your contingency. So if you look under under 8E, which is preliminary title, it says, this agreement is contingent upon buyer's ability to obtain a title policy provided for, paragraph 13G, which is talking about the title, and on buyer's review of a current preliminary report and items that are disclosed or observable, even if not on record or not specified in the report, and satisfying buyer regarding the current status of title. And then it says down below that buyer has 5 days after receipt to review a revised preliminary, or any if furnished by the title company, and cancel the transaction if the revised report reveals any material or substantial deviations. So, if they send you the revised title report, and all of a sudden there's a big old lien on there, and it's going to go with the property as opposed to stay with the seller, your buyer then has a right to cancel based on this title clause here, this title contingency, because the title company cannot pass clear and marketable title to the buyer. Or I should say the seller can't pass clear and marketable title to the buyer. And that is, clear and marketable title is what the title contingency is supposed to ensure. So one other interesting point here is it talks about within E1, it talks about items that are disclosed or observable, even if not on record. So what that is talking about is, and I'll give you an example. Let's just say you have two homes that sit side by side, and they share a driveway that goes between the two homes. The driveway is actually on both parcels. When you visit the property, you can see that. You can see that there's not a fence that separates the property. There's not a fence separating that driveway. So it's obvious to the eye when you see it that there's a shared driveway. That would not be an event that your title policy would insure your buyer against if they later made a claim against the title company saying, wait a second, I've got this driveway that's hinging on my property, or vice versa. It's obvious to anybody that goes there that this is a shared driveway, and along with that would have shared maintenance costs and stuff like that. So just something to consider. Condominium planned development disclosures, if applicable. So just because a property, is there anybody that doesn't know what a condominium is? Okay, that's pretty easy, right? But you also have planned communities that are part of a master plan that are not condos, they're single-family homes. A great example would be Natomas Park. Right? You've got 5,270 homes that are all part of Natomas Park. They're all single-family homes. They share a clubhouse, and they have rules that you have to follow in terms of parking on the street, maintenance of your paint on your home, changing the look of your house, regularly filling wood chips in your planter boxes to make them all look consistent, bringing your garbage cans in within, on the day that garbage is picked up, on and on and on and on. Some people like living in homeowner association controlled communities. Some people hate it because they don't like being. It's 6 of one, half dozen. But if there is an HOA that controls a property and controls what you can do on it, the seller of that property is required under the civil code to provide a certain number of documents, certain type of documents to the buyer as part of their disclosures. Those documents would include the rules and regulations of the homeowners association, bylaws, articles of incorporation, budgets, insurance information for the association. Let's see. Oh, any lawsuits that are ongoing. Why is that? I can tell you one from my own personal experience. If you're representing a buyer and you're actually buying into a condo complex, if there are, let's just say your buyer is an FHA or more likely an FHA. Let's just say it's an FHA buyer, and you get a whole packet of HOA docs. If you don't take the time to read those, look at the section on litigation, and see that there is currently a massive lawsuit against the developer because of whatever, pick your flavor of construction defect. It's very likely FHA will not issue a loan insuring a property within that complex. And I know several years ago there were several HOA with condominiums and townhouses where you could not get an FHA loan for a buyer. It's loosened up a little bit because a lot of the litigation is kind of cleared cracks. But if you're interested, you can actually, there is a site that is maintained by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You can Google FHA approved homeowners associations, and it'll give you an alphabetical list. You can go by city, by state, give you an alphabetical list of all of the HOAs that it's done business with, and it will tell you who. But it's better if you don't catch that before you go into escrow. It is real helpful if you can, for the buyer, if you can catch that the second you get your HOA docs and you look under litigation, and then that keys you to do an additional check, and you talk to the lender and find out, whoa, pump the brakes. Let's not order this buyer's appraisal at $600. Let's not order a home inspection because we can't do the loan. Okay? If you're the buyer, I am sure you would appreciate your agent giving you that information before you've spent the money as opposed to after. So, again, with the condominium plan development disclosures, HOA docs, do not just be a paper shuffle and hand them over. Take the time to do your due diligence and take a look at them. I'm not telling you you have to read every page, but read the important stuff. And then make sure you talk to the lender and it's an FHA buyer or VA buyer. Make sure they can do the deal there in that association. Let's see. Also, the bylaws of the associations. Bylaws of the associations, they can be very important to people. I can tell you in my community, they are sticklers for enforcing the rules. If I leave my garbage can out and it's still there the next morning, I guarantee you that one of the little snoopers for the association is going to have my name down. They'll take a picture of it and they will send it to the management company, and I'll get a threat. I make it a point not to forget because I don't want to have to get my blood pressure rising from dealing with those people. But a lot of people get really insensitive, and so if you're dealing with, say, a first-time buyer, and you get these HOA docs, the community is in HOA. You have a talk with them and say, look, we won't know until we get the rules and regulations, but some HOAs are really strict about what you do with your house. Some of them are pretty lax and pretty chill. You just got to make sure you understand the rules and stick with them, because otherwise they can fine you. And believe it or not, in California and some other states, HOAs have fined people. People have failed to pay the fines after warnings, and the HOA has actually closed their fines, taken the house into possession. I mean, these people, they don't mess around, and they have the full backing up the law, at least in California, behind it. So, and then you've got communities like Regency Park in this area, where if you go through Regency Park, you'll notice there's lots of cars parked on the street. It's more narrower sometimes. You got basketball hoops and things like that out there. Some people love that. Some people love the empty streets. It just depends on who you're working with, what the preferences are. But these HOA documents, when you get them, are very important for the buyer to consider, not just for you to shuffle the paperwork and say, here, sign this. Again, you want to do your due diligence. The next one, buyer review of leased or liened items contingency. This has become a real big one, mainly because of PACE loans that come with a lot of the solar systems that come, even alarm systems, HVAC systems that you have. Does anybody know what a PACE loan is? No. They're heavily used for solar. A PACE loan is a loan that goes on title to the house. And so let's just say I buy a house, I have a loan for $100,000, it's in first place. They have the first mortgage with them. Get a PACE loan, that now becomes a loan on my property too. But that loan takes precedence over any new loans that come on, and it doesn't drop off title. So if it's not paid off, it creates a cloud on title that is the responsibility of the owner. So for that reason, if you take a listing on a property with a PACE, FHA will not give a loan. So there's a PACE loan in place. Unless the seller agrees they're going to pay off the PACE loan, an FHA buyer would not be able to get that property. So when you're looking at the listing, if they talk about a solar system leased, or actually solar system, whether it's leased or owned, I would talk to the listing agent before you write the offer, find out if there's a PACE loan, and if there's any chance at all buyer finance that system and there's a PACE loan, just write it into your contract, seller to clear a PACE loan. It may make the negotiation more difficult, but better to deal with it up front than to go through the expense of a home inspection, pest inspection if you're doing that, appraisal, all that stuff, and then have the buyer, decide they want to cancel. They don't want to deal with this. HVAC systems. Sometimes the HVAC companies finance a new system through use of PACE. That's where you'll see it also. So that's what this buyer review of leased items contingency. Removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer. So they put this in here, and it basically is to cover everybody. It says, buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless sellers provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, and information pertaining to that contingency. If buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from the seller, buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. If buyer removes or waives any contingency without an adequate understanding of the property's condition, buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of the agent. Well, does this verbiage help the buyer understand what they're doing? Absolutely. But I think more importantly, it was put in here, I think, to insulate us from liability. Because it is making it very, very clear that the buyer better think twice before they do this, because it can come back and bite them. So let's go through, before I get to H, I want to go through a particularly painful discussion about what happens if you go under contract, you're representing a buyer, and towards the end of your inspection period, you've got your home inspection back from the home inspector. You've gone over it with the buyer. You're like me, you've actually had the buyer also talk with the home inspector. I like to do that because the home inspector will often, anytime you look at one of these inspections, even on a brand new home, they have to find something. And when you see it in print, sometimes it can be very helpful for a buyer. So what I like to do is I'll have the home inspector just meet with the buyer briefly when they've done the inspection, just kind of explain to them the health and safety issues, the more serious issues, things that have to be taken care of right away, as opposed to stuff that's more cosmetic or maintenance dealt with a period of time as you go. That way, the home inspector can kind of give them, from his own perspective or her own perspective, their opinion of the house, and it's not so overwhelming. The client actually looks at the report. But let's just say you're coming up at the end of your inspection period, and you're coming up on that date where the contract says that you have agreed to remove the inspection contingency. But now there's a health and safety issue that's reared its head. And let's just say it's significant. Well, if you're, the agent that we think you are, you're going to talk to your client. You're going to say, look, this is not an insignificant issue. This is a pretty serious one. Let's say it's an electrical issue that could cause a fire. A serious one. They've mixed the wrong kind of wire on an old knob and tube system, and it could break out in a fire for any reason at any time. So you say to the client, look, I think we should write a request for repairs, and I think we should, sometimes the seller will come back and they'll offer a credit in lieu of repairs. And there are situations, it's not a health and safety issue, where that might be something that you can advocate for the client along. But if it's a serious issue that really cause injury or something, you might want to push that the actual repairs be done. Well, a lot of agents get confused and they think that because they've submitted a request for repairs, the inspection period clock has stopped. That you're marking time waiting for the seller to get back to you on your request for repairs, and you don't have to continue and issue your contingencies. Well, that's wrong. Contractually, just because you've submitted a request for repairs, that doesn't mean that the contingency period timeline has stopped or changed. Technically, if you don't remove the contingency on the day that it's due, your client is in breach of contract. Now, will the seller cancel? Probably not. They don't have to enforce that contingency, but just because they're not enforcing it doesn't mean the client's not in breach. You need to distinguish in your minds, there is a complete separate wall between sending a request for repairs prior to the seller and removal of those contingencies. You're not excused from contingencies. Now, would I remove the contingency for inspections? Hell no. And I would caution, the discussion I would have with my client is something along the lines of, look, John, you have a serious electrical problem that this inspector has pointed out in his house. Ideally, we want the seller to correct that before we move forward with this deal. So what I would recommend is I will write up a request for repairs asking them to take care of that prior to close of escrow. He can respond a couple of different ways. One, he could say, to hell with you, I'm not doing the work. You need to remove your inspection contingency now. If you refuse at that point, he can issue a notice to perform, meaning he can't just cancel on you right away because you've exceeded inspection period deadline. He has to first issue a notice to reform. He has to wait a couple days that's specified in the notice to reform. And then if you still don't remove the contingency, the seller can cancel the contract, what we say unilateral, meaning on his own. He doesn't have to have agreement with the buyer to cancel. Now, in that circumstance, since you have not removed your contingencies, he would have to agree to release the buyer's deposit. The other response that you could get from the seller is, absolutely, I will take care of that repair. And he would respond in writing, agreeing to take care of the repair. Once you have the seller agreeing to do the repair, then you can remove that contingency. That's the only. And so now you've accomplished both. You've got the seller to agree to fix it, and you're still in compliance because you contingency inspections. He could also still respond back and say, I don't want to dig into this and try to fix it. We have a bid. We got a bid from an electrician. He says it's going to be, $1,000 to fix it. How about if I credit the buyer $2,500 and the buyer can, and that is then a discussion that you have to have with the client. And what I always tell them when it comes to repairs like that is it's really risky to assume the liability on your own to your repairs, because when you go into a wall, you never know what other surprises you're going to find. Sometimes you go in thinking you're going to take care of a bad, plug. Let's just say it's a plug that doesn't work, and you realize, oh gosh, okay, the seller's going to credit me $100. I'll just have the electrician replace it. The electrician comes out and says, oh, it's not the plug that's bad. It looks like you have a bad fuse box, and now it's going to be $2,000 fuse panel. So it's always better if you're representing the buyer. It's always better to risk the seller by having the seller fix it. If you're representing the seller, it's always better to try to transfer the risk to the buyer by getting the buyer to just say, okay, I'll agree to move my inspection contingency if the buyer accepts a check for X amount of money. That goes the best one. And you can target that money to pay buyers for non-closing costs or any other thing that lender says it's okay to use it. So I just wanted to make it clear that just because there's an outstanding issue of, say, a property condition, that is not an excuse to refuse to remove contingencies. I'll talk about removal of loan contingencies. If I'm representing a buyer, one of the things I like to do early on is I like to have my own conversation with the buyer's lender. Because, a lot of times, especially nowadays, you've got these online lenders. They just fly by the seat of their pants. They get a letter, a pre-approval letter, and it claims to have looked at X, Y, and Z of the buyer, and it maybe sounds like they did a verification of employment, or they went through full underwriting, but it really didn't. It's just fancy wording to make it sound like these buyers are full. So I like to try to get a hold of the actual lender, and especially in a competitive market we have today, I like to actually loop the lender in on the email that I send over to the listing agent and say, look, I've been working with, I'll use Monty Maxwell for 15 years, and he says he's going to close on a buyer. It happens. It just always comes through. However, please feel free to contact Monty. I've copied him on this email, and he can satisfy you as to the credit worthiness of or something like that. But you always want to have the lender involved, because if they're there's a problem, that lender may be able to fix it. And they can also help you get the deal. To say that issue. Let's see. Talked about, so going back to removal of contingencies of the buyer. Buyer has basically two options. They can remove the contingencies, they can cancel their sale. Now, that's after they've been issued a notice to reform. So like the example we spoke of with the electric problem, we know that our client's in breach by holding off to see what the seller's going to do with that request. So that interim period between when we send it over and after the contingency period has gone by, and the seller's agent is waiting for us to remove that contingency, in that period of time, we're actually in breach. But that breach won't cause us to lose the deal until the seller has sent notice to and has waited the statutory period, whereupon then they can cancel. Other than that scenario, the buyer only, if the seller refuses to do any work or doesn't want to do anything, doesn't want to offer money, the buyer only has two reasonable alternatives. They can go ahead with the purchase, without dealing with that issue. So they can waive their inspection contingency or whatever other contingency, just move forward, or they're allowed to cancel. And the only downside to that is they've lost the money they spent. Appraisal, home inspection, maybe a pest inspection, a sewer inspection if they've done, and so on and so forth. So that's referenced here in paragraph I. The only real contingencies that, there's one more I want to cover here. Sale of the buyer's property. One of the big problems we've seen, especially the last several months, is, and it's not just with sellers, it's tenants too. You leave one place, you still have to find another place to live. And then the other problem, which is less of a problem for the buyer these days, they already own a house. It's pretty sure that they will be able to sell their house, which is what it's referencing in paragraph J, sale of buyer's. So, a lot of times, might get a offer, and the offer from the buyer comes with a contingency that says that buyer does not have to complete the purchase unless they can sell their house, because the buyer needs the money from their house in order to complete the purchase. That is covered under a ZIP Form COP, which you would include with your offer. You'd also check a box under 8J. You check that little box there, and it will attach the COP form. And there are different levels of the sale of buyer's property. It might be the buyer's property isn't even listed yet. It might be that the property is not only listed, but it's already in escrow, and it's out with the title company, and it's moving through the process. It might be that it's ready to close in the next week, and this buyer is desperate, need to buy. It just depends, and you'll identify those factors within the Form COP. In a super hot market like we have now, or I think it's starting to, in a market like we have today, it's very unlikely that a seller would take a buyer who is contingent on the sale. Not to say it couldn't happen, but if a seller is getting multiple offers, and most of them don't have contingency for the sale of the buyer's property attached to it, they'll probably. Now, contingency removal form. I attached one of those also, just so you can see. It's got a couple different options here. Section 1 talks about the removal of buyer contingencies, and let's see here. says buyers shall conclusively be deemed to have, one, completed all buyer investigations and review of reports or other applicable information and disclosures, two, elected to proceed with the transaction, three, assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense, if any, for repairs, corrections, or for the inability to obtain financing. Waiver of statutory disclosures is by law. That last sentence means is that, for example, seller is required to provide a transfer disclosure statement in most circumstances. Buyer cannot waive the seller completing the transfer disclosure statement. I mean, they could put it in contract form where the buyer's agreeing to it, but it's not enforceable because it's a statutory disclosure. Paragraph 2 is where the buyer can remove only specific buyer contingencies. And when you use this form, you could just, let's just say you had different removal dates for the appraisal contingency, loan contingency, or the common interest documents. You could, if those had to be removed early, you could check those boxes and have the buyer sign the form and send it on to the seller, and that drops off those contingencies. So you might have throughout the life of the transaction, you might have contingency one, you might have contingency number two, you might even have contingency three, which might be, you check number 4, which is buyer hereby removes any and all buyer contingencies. If, rather than check all of, a bunch of those listed under number 2, you could use number 3 and say, which is all buyer contingencies are removed except, and when you check those boxes, you're telling them the ones that aren't being. And then it has seller removal of seller contingencies. So that might be seller contingency to find a replacement property, in which case car form SPRP is going to be included as part of the contract. Closing on a replacement, which is the same. Or you have a space for other in case there's some other seller contingency there. That is kind of the meat of it. Are there any questions? I know it's not the most interesting of topics, but it is kind of.
For the appraisal, so what's the amount that you typically put there, or what's supposed to be there?
You look here. Oh, the amount that will be there is going to be it's going to be the purchase price. Is what it's going to be. That's under 8B.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are willing to pay up to a certain amount of appraisal gap.
There,
Is that
then you can put that amount there. You can put it in there. And then in addition to that, there's a spot in the actual contract that has a couple of lines for other terms. I'll also reference it.
when I say the house is 400,000 and the buyer's going to pay up to 10 or 4, and the buyer's willing to pay 10,000 appraisal gap, then you put
400. No.
Oh wait, you put 400.
If you're willing to pay 410, and you think it's only going to appraise at 4, you can put 410 there.
410.
I'm sorry. Wait. I'm sorry. Hang on. Yeah, you put the higher amount there.
The higher amount of the most that you're willing
Yeah.
to develop.
Oh, so like the 410. So say it's say it's 400 and like.
Wait. I'm sorry. Back up. Appraisal contingency based appraisal value at a minimum purchase price, or, you put lower amount. Yeah. Because your gap is going to be lower, because when it appraises.
So if it's listed for
Let's
400,000.
say your offer is at 400,000, but you don't think it's going to appraise it. You think it's going to appraise at 390. You would put at a minimum purchase price for 390. I'm sorry. Now you had a question.
Yeah, oh yeah, okay, so say like the home is listed for 400 and you're willing to, and your buyer is willing to put 450 on that? So you wouldn't put 450
No,
on
you
there?
put, if your buyer is willing to bridge the gap between 450, or between 400 and 450, 400.
Okay,
And that way, if it appraises at 400, you're still willing to purchase it at the higher price.
okay. So that you would put the
You put
purchase price, the listing price of it there.
you put purchase price there,
Right.
the offer price.
Oh, okay,
And what you're saying then is as long as it appraises at my offer price, no, you're saying you're going to go over. Yeah. So let's just say it's listed at 400 and you offer 450. What you're going to put here is it has to appraise at a minimum of the purchase price, or, and we've used the or, check the box, and put 400. That way you're telling the other side that if it doesn't appraise at your purchase price, you're still willing to go forward. If it only appraised, you're still willing to go forward up to 450. Does that make sense? I think they made it more
I
confusing.
know, I
than this
hate
way.
that part. So you would just write in the terms still, right?
I would write the
Because,
terms.
yeah.
oh, you also mentioned about like the condominiums.
Yeah.
So usually they typically put HOAs, so are you saying that they're not as friendly with FHA buyers?
No, I'm saying that if you're going to run into a problem with financing on an FHA loan, it's going to be typically with a condo project or a subdivision of condominiums in which there is litigation going on in that condo. So I'll give you an example. If you drive up Truxell and you cross Truxell, get to San Juan, take a right, there's a whole complex over there called Del Free. Across the street from Del Free, I can't remember the name of the complex, there's another complex, and they'll be on your right as you're going to turn from Truxell onto San Juan. That complex, many years ago, they discovered they had buildings that were shifting, and they had to do a lot of foundation. And all of this was happening because there's an underground stream that comes down basically through Truxell and cuts under there, and it was causing the things to shift. So one of two different things happened. One, they tried suing the developer. They'd already passed the statute of limitations, and they couldn't successfully get money from the developer, which meant the homeowners association, in order to survive, they levied a special assessment against every condo, and it was significant, multiple thousands of dollars. I don't remember the exact amount, but those homeowners had to pay back that money in order for the association to finance all the repairs. Well, that did two things. Jacked up, I think at the time, the HOA dues went up to, I want to say it was like $500. It's just really radical. Compared to Thomas Park, like $72 or or some of the other areas that are $235. But it jacked up the HOA monthly dues extremely high. Also, FHA doesn't say can't do financing this contract. A, because of litigation, B, because of there was a complex corner of East Commerce and North is a complex. It's a newer complex. I don't recall the exact name of it, but it's directly across the street from the H. Allen High School. And there was a time where you could get FHA financing there because the association was in litigation for somebody that had fallen and injured themselves. And just that piece of litigation prevented FHA buyers from buying. There's a association off Club Center, as you just down from the church, back from Thomas Park. It's not part of it. They had construction defect issues. They were suing the developer. That prevented them from doing FHA financing. That's now resolved. The safest bet is to go online to the FHA, the HUD site. It shows the status of each of these associations. And it's probably a good idea to even do that before you write an FHA offer. I think another one I recall was Cobblestone down in South Side. But that's the circumstance where you run into problems with financing. Usually it's going to involve an FHA.
Something on the line.
Was that
A big line.
one more time?
It's something that there's a defect, and there should have authority so they can decline your loan.
Oh yeah, but you would have a way of knowing before you even write the offer. You can go onto the site and you can dial it down to the city of Sacramento, county of Sacramento, however you want to do it. And all the HOA, the homeowners association names are in there. And you can basically go scroll across and it'll tell you if you currently have approval in place or if it's suspended or expired.
Basically, they have a list like where you can apply for your loan.
They have a list of the status. Most of the associations probably don't have a problem. But if you recall, not only was there litigation, and you see more of it in the newer association. That's where all of a sudden the construction. But also back when we had a lot of closures in 2000. What happened was you had so many units within those complexes that were in default that the finances of management of the association wasn't solvent. And that was the other reason that they were taken off. You have to have a solvent management HOA in order to maintain the grounds, do the maintenance. So, as time changes, circumstances change, things get better. Any other questions?
If you keep violating CCR, do they have authority on the property?
One more time, I'm hard of hearing. You got an accent.
If you're keep violating CCR, do you have authority on the property?
Oh, CC&Rs, absolutely. CC&Rs, for those of you that don't know, are abbreviation for covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Those are also part of what your client will get to inspect. So a lot of times you'll find escrow officers, for whatever reason, don't send you a copy of the CC&Rs along with the preliminary title report. Thank you for asking. That's helpful. So always make it a point to, when you're opening escrow, when you're working with your escrow officer, always make it a point to ensure that they are going to send you CC&Rs if they exist for that. Not all properties have CC&Rs, but I'd say probably the majority of them do. Just assume they do and ask for them. They tell you there are none, that's fine. But if they have them, want to get a copy of them, just like any other forms, disclosures, documents, want to have your client initials that they've received a copy. Now, the thing about CC&Rs are a document that is formed from the initial development. So, usually they go back quite a ways. The ones over here for Natomas Park, they're probably about 180 pages. They're pretty thick. And they were produced after a whole mess of other small parcels purchased by the master developer, banded together, and then the master developer issued these covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which talk about what can and cannot be done on this property. For an HOA property, they're doubly important because the CC&Rs are the documents that are filed on record that allow a development to form an HOA. Without being given that permission in the CC&Rs, they cannot form an HOA and levy monthly HOA bills on properties there or enforce the CC&Rs or rules of the association. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but one other thing that you should know. If you are working on a transaction with an older home in Sacramento County, probably most areas of California, and when I say older home, I'm talking about a home that the CC&Rs were produced prior to about 1960 or 60. There will be a document at the very first page of the CC&Rs, and that document, you'll notice, will say something to the effect of, if there are restrictive covenants that are a violation of fair housing law or discriminate racially within these documents, they are invalid by law. The reason they do that is because we are descendants in not just the South, but in California, come from a very racially prejudiced and bigoted group of people. And it is very common today that if you enter escrow on a property, I'll give an example, say in Rio Linda, that was built in the 1940s or 1950s, it's going to have a sentence in the CC&Rs that says, you may not sell this property to anyone who is not of the Caucasian persuasion. This is extremely common, and it is distressing for your buyer client if they read that and they have not been prepared for what they might be seeing. And so I told you it's important not to just be a paper shuffle and to look at your document. Let's face it, guys. It is really not that difficult what we do. We take a few pictures, we meet somebody at a house, we show them a house, we do some paperwork at their home or at a coffee shop, and everything changes hands, and we put a few emails, and in the end, collect a sizable check for doing that. A lot of us will brag, well, I have X years of expertise and whatnot, but when you boil it all down, the process itself it's not that taxing on us. It doesn't put us out. It's really pretty easy compared to the guy that's walking around cleaning out septic systems or working as a mechanic day in, day out. It's easy stuff. And we get paid pretty well to do it. So the least we can do for our clients is to give it 100%, work for their benefit, right? And, so one of the things I like to do when I get these CC&Rs is I'll take a quick look at it. And I will see if there's anything like that reference. And I like to tell my clients ahead of time. And I preface it by saying, look, these were done a long time ago. there were discriminatory practices back then that are no longer allowed today for obvious reasons. And the problem, though, is it is very, very expensive to get these CCNRs changed. And that's why nobody ever bothers to do it. Because you literally have to go to every single home in the subdivision that's covered by these CCNRs and get them to agree to change it. Then you got to come up with money and go to a lawyer and have that law office prepare and file new money. And it's thousands and thousands of. So in order to get around that, the state passed a law that said, we're just making all this stuff. It's also unethical. So just because it's there doesn't mean it means it's not out. But just be prepared, because that day is going to come when you're going to be in a transaction. And you'll remember, you see those CCNRs kind of old-looking, done on a typewriter. And you're going to think, yeah, Bruce told me to check this out. And you will see it, and it will blow your mind. More importantly, you'll be prepared to have a discussion. Anything else?
Oh, when you so with all these contingencies in terms of the buyer reviewing all these documents, like the prelim, review seller docs, like that. So do you just send them those documents, or do you have to review it with them?
Well, you can do it. You can do it a couple different ways. So, do you know what you've heard of an agent visual inspection disclosure? Okay. So, in order to do an ABID, you actually have to be in the house, right? So, one thing you can do is you collect all these disclosures from the listing side, the listing agent, get them all together, and you can even make a second copy for yourself. You can email a full set to them, make a second copy for yourself, and you can put a little red reviewed stamp on them. And when you go out to do your ABID, you can make an appointment with your client to come out with you. And they can sit there in the house, assuming it's a vacant property. They can sit there in the house, review the documents while you're there doing your ABID, talk about it with them. They can even take their set home with them, just get them to initial if they received a copy while they're there. You take them back with you. You have them sign your ABID while you're there. That way, you got that done. Or you can DocuSign that to them later. However you want to do it. But it's not your job to go through them page by page with your client. I'm talking about the CCNRs. But you do want to point out major issues. If you know that they're planning on parking an RV in front of their house, you're going to let their daughter park an RV in their house for half of every month when she's passing through this park. And you know that, and I'll use the Thomas Park again. You can't park any vehicle in the street for 24 hours, let alone an RV. That's going to be a problem. Then you probably want to. You don't have to go through all the different rules. Let's read them, understand them. If there's something that you know that is adverse to use, they had planned on and expressed to you in your discussions, that's probably a good thing to point out to them. To finish answering your question, different ways you can go through the signing of them, going through their forms and disclosure and signing. The other thing you can do is you can deliver the whole thing to them, whether it's at home, wherever. Most people have the ability to print out that many pages. So give them a copy of them and say, I need you to review these, initial them, sign them where indicated, and I would tab, sign, that sort of thing. Some people go through the trouble of setting a DocuSign documents. I personally believe it's less likely you're actually going to read this stuff, really review it. You send it to them via DocuSign like that, because people get lazy and they'll skip it, and there might be something important to them to know. They might have a question about something, and if they ask you a question about something, answer it to the best of your ability. If you can't answer the question and it's relevant, just tell them, look, question about zoning or something like that, what they can do with the property if something is permitted, you are not the person to answer that question. What you can do is you can direct them to the appropriate source and permit office, things like that. Let them do the research. If you go ahead and decide to do that, you are accepting liability for the information. And I don't do that. You tell them website names, you give them the address to county or city office. You give them all that information, and they have a walk-in desk, research this stuff, you can do that stuff. I had a listing on Garden Highway that was a drug house. Guy was growing pot, commercial pot operation. This is talking $1 million. This stuff. But it needed 100,000 before it became REO after federal seized property tax liens related to a federal drug investigation. And that place, because the owner had put up a brick fence line along the front of the house on Garden Highway. Garden Highway in that particular county is an actual flood. So the river rose, it would go over that wall or over that property, and by putting the wall up, weakened road surface. And so there were all sorts of liens against the house that required the owner to remove that wall. And if they didn't, there's heavy penalties. We could not tell buying it what they had to do to rectify that problem. We had to direct to the appropriate sources who then worked with them directly. So they got all the information first. If we had told them, they'd be coming after us.
Yeah.
Don't tell them. Your expertise, your license is as a real estate professional. Help buy and sell homes. You do not help people build. You don't give legal advice. You don't give accounting advice. I am. I've gone to law school. I'm not a practicing attorney. I don't give legal advice. I have an MBA. I know a lot about numbers. I don't give any tax advice. I refer them to CPAs. Home inspections. You don't want to give the party a particular home inspector's name. You can give them the CREA website. They can choose their own home inspector. Or if you have, a dozen home inspectors that you love to use, give them a list of those inspectors and say, interview these guys and see if there's one you want to use. Every time you do something like that, it's like holding open your arms and saying, make me liable for any problems you. And you don't want to step beyond the scope of
Don't say
I hate to put it that way, but
Don't
that's,
say anything unless they say
No, I mean,
something.
there's, you can say, look, and what I've always said, the people, investors especially, they'll say, what about the taxes on this and taxes on that? I said, I know a little bit about taxes, but that's not my specialty. I'm a licensed real estate. You ask me anything about the process and the marketing involved and how to sell a house and how to represent a buyer, I'm your man. But if you ask me about capital tax gains, tax rate on a flip that you're going to do, I'm going to refer you to go contact your CPA. If you're asking me how you should take title to a property, now, do I know the differences between tenants and joint tenants and the rules about community property and all that stuff? Absolutely. I learned that stuff in law school. But I'm not a licensed attorney, so I'm not going to tell them that. I say, if you have any questions about that, talk to your tax professional, talk to your Anything else? Let's see. How about you? Do you have any questions? You'll have to unmute if you do. Guess not. All right. If nothing further, that is